Hi, my name is Ellie Falades Ganellan. I'm the director of the Greek Chamber Music Project, which commissioned Talos Dreams. We've put a lot of time and energy and love into producing this pandemic-friendly performance with fancy Zoom tech and a series of music videos. If you enjoy the performance, I encourage you to make a tax-deductible contribution to the Greek Chamber Music Project, or you can also purchase our newest album on the GCMP label called Synchronos New Greek Voices. Both of those links are in the description. Thanks so much.
So we're delighted that you're all here today. I'm Susan Weiss from the Peabody Conservatory of Music at Johns Hopkins. I see Jen is here, also from Johns Hopkins. Thank you, Jen. So Talos Dreams is a piece by Costas Dafnis, who's here with us today, commissioned by the Greek Chamber Music Project with support from San Francisco Conservatory of Music faculty grant. And it's inspired by the book Gods and Robots by Adrienne Mayor of Stanford University, based on the tale of Talos, the mythical robot that guarded Crete against the invaders. This performance is sponsored by the Johns Hopkins University History of Art and the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute and the Peabody Institute. So without further ado, I'm going to turf it to Costas, this wonderful creator of the instrument and the piece. Costas.
Thank you so much, Susan. Yes, we are very happy to be here today. And I just wanted to give a little bit of a heads up about the program notes that you'll see. The program notes that you can see in the chat right now. If you follow them, they'll give a little bit of information about the myth. A lot of us will be familiar with the kind of mythical basis of some of these movements. But just so you know, there's a little bit of extra information on top there. And then everything that follows that in black text is basically pre-compositional words that I was working on as I was planning the piece. We had the idea to then also kind of bring it around into the more mechanistic realm by actually plugging those words into basically a text generator that uses artificial intelligence. It's developed actually by Facebook called Megatron 11B. It's a neural network that generated the extra text there. And so the AI was actually trying to complete the texts. So each individual piece that you can see begins in black and then continues to blue. And so those are the unedited, basically, responses of a machine. So with that, I think we are ready to begin. I do recommend if you want the full program note experience, you can have it on your phone while you're watching on the computer screen. So check that out. And here we go. This is Talos Dreams.
amazing. Thank you all so much. It was just brilliant. And I know there are probably going to be many, many questions. Um, I mean, I have some, but I'll wait. I just wanted to say I forgot to mention that Louis Patzner is a Peabody alum who was in the studio of Amit Peled, graduated in 2007. So forgive me for not mentioning that earlier. We have another Peabody connection.
It's all good. It's nice to be back.
Yeah.
If not in person, at least remotely in the old Mount Vernon block.
Yes. Yes. Well, come back in real time soon.
I hope so.
Okay. In fact, all of you.
Well, thank you so much again, Susan, and everyone for being here. It really is an honor to play for you. We've all been hungry for opportunities to play music, and this format has its restrictions, but you mentioned the ghostplate, and I would love to hear any questions about anything. But first, are there any objections to me just playing live a little bit of ghostplate just to kind of show you guys the techniques? Nope. Okay, that's cool. Great. I'm going to switch to a different camera really quick, and you'll see me pop up on the one called Ghostplate Demo. So just to give a kind of a brief overview, the ghostplate is this big stainless steel plate with all of these different sizes and materials of rods welded onto it. I had the pleasure of actually welding this instrument with the instrument inventor who kind of designed this entire series of instruments. This one is unique. It's the only one of its kind. But Tom Nunn is a San Francisco-based experimental musician who just has done an entire series called Space Plates. So this is what it's largely based on. So I'll just play for you a couple of quick examples for kind of the different sounds that you heard throughout the different movements. The main way that the ghost plate is played is with a bow in each hand. And so I'm using, these are, I think, about 3/4 size violin bows. And so one in each hand. And the opening motif, for instance, of I-core is bowed like this. There's a lot of really lovely opportunities for sounds there, especially in the ways that they blended with the violin and cello in those movements where they are featured. One of the other main ways that you would have heard it played is also with these series of mallets. I used sticks from my own garden specifically to create all these mallets. So here's a small mallet. Here's what it sounds like on these inner tines here. The movement Pandora has quite a bit of this. Of course. The other main way that I love to make sounds with this instrument is actually through friction right along the edge of the plate. And so here's yet another stick. So that's great for a lot of the more kind of sound designy skittering noises. And then just as a bonus, this is not technically created from the ghost plate itself, but there's a sound in Pandora, the kind of scratching, kind of bubbling up sound that happens. And the entire ghost plate actually to create no friction so that it rings like this. There's no reverb or anything applied to the plate. It's all acoustic. But to reduce that friction, it sits up on balloons. And so that particular sound that recurs, I think, 7 times throughout the movement Pandora was actually created just with fingertips on the actual rubber of the balloons underneath the plate. So that's the ghost plate. I'm going to switch over back to the other camera, and happy to hear any questions either about this or about the music or about anything going on, really.
I had one. Well, it's two actually, on mechanism and materials, and he already explained some of those materials. But I'm wondering the rods and the plate itself, and also the tuning.
The rods themselves, well, basically the process of welding it was experimental in and of itself, and you kind of I was recommended by Tom Nunn not to get too specific about where the tuning was going to go, because you basically have to let the plate be a good kind of resonance, because it's basically becoming one singular piece of metal by the time you're welding it. So there's a lot of sympathetic vibration and resonance that happens, and so because of that, it was a process of we actually welded on. Most of the rods were about as long as the longest rods, and we cut them down, roughly to size, and then they were actually just shaved down with a file, and so that they could actually be tuned. And of course, they're not sharp, so it's a little slightly less dangerous instrument once the tops of those are filed off. But yeah, so the tuning of it was kind of it was a give and take. I knew what I wanted, and I knew that I liked roughly some scalar motion, but I did want a little bit of microtonality in there as well. And so, unfortunately, the more microtonality there is, the more kind of crazy vibrations that you get, because they're not, kind of sympathetic with each other. But it's overall the tuning of it is part of the process. I had to write specifically for this instrument. Once I tuned it and got everything ready to go, I was a little bit beholden to the notes that it was able to produce at a given time.
So I guess how did that work with the acoustic instruments, with the strings and the winds? How did they feel about having to?
Well, I should turn that over to them. I know that there were times when I instructed everybody to not tune to the instrument, to especially the strings. They're always listening, and that's kind of a bowed sound that feels familiar. But Lewis or Ariel, especially, did you have any thoughts on was that tricky to try to tune against the ghost plate at times?
Playing a tune is it's always tricky. It's the endless challenge of playing a non-fretted instrument. Did the ghost plate make it harder? Yes. Was it something that prevented me from doing my best work? No. It's just one of those things where you have to accept that there's a soundscape.
Was playing with the ghost plate intonation-wise difficult? The answer is playing in tune on a non-fretted instrument is always a challenge. It's the continuous challenge of playing these instruments, and we work all the time to just be able to do it adequately. So yeah, and it was a challenge to have a soundscape that might not line up with, a traditional scale. Part of being a musician in the modern world is that you're going to do things that don't really line up with the tradition, whether that's a scale or playing with certain effects or just playing in certain tonalities. And so I thought it was a cool challenge, and but it doesn't mean that it wasn't challenging.
While woodwind instruments are perhaps thought of as being more stable in terms of intonation, we don't have frets, but we've got buttons. But the dirty secret is we are constantly adjusting all the time anyway, and there's more wiggle room within intonation than we might care to admit. But here I am admitting it in a the score where Costas asked us to do more timbrally oriented things, multiphonics and extended techniques, quote unquote, that are more about tone color. And personally, that's very much a happy place for me. And in fact, I also do a lot of work as an improviser, and some of my first creative projects that I did after moving to the San Francisco Bay Area were in a quartet with Tom Tom Nunn, with the inventor of those instruments. So it was fun to get back into that soundscape that Lewis referred to, and to be swimming around in that microtonal stew again. It's like a homecoming of sorts.
That really ties in with a question that was asked about hearing more about the selection of instruments in the ensemble, whether they brought out different elements of the ghost plate. And I think you've kind of answered that in some ways. And the others of you may want to chime in. But there's also a terrific question from Jen Steger. So we'll maybe talk about this selection of instruments first, and then go to her question, which is on a different subject.
Absolutely. So I had approached Costas a little more than a year ago about this project. We'd actually done a jam session, several years ago. As soon as I learned about the ghost plate, I was like, I need to know more about this. This is such a cool instrument. And he's written for a film. He's in a film score that includes it, and a contemporary orchestral piece. It sounds beautiful all together in that soundscape. So we did a jam session on flute and ghost plate, and I did a lot of pitch bending to kind of adapt to the sound. As Kyle mentions, woodwind instruments do have some wiggle, even with all the buttons, there's still plenty of acoustic wiggle room in the pitch. And it was just a really fun experience to, adapt and, listen and create something really new. Also because of the really resonant quality of the ghost plate, the flute could play into the ghost plate and create some really interesting echoes and things like that. So yeah, that was definitely an intimate starting point, the flute and the ghost plate, but we wanted to have kind of a balance. We talked maybe about a string quartet or something, and we finally settled on a balance of string and wind instruments, kind of having that pairing, was really interesting. And the ghost plate kind of fits in at the intersection of those instruments for different reasons. So Costas, I don't know if you want to weigh in on that more.
Well, I'll just follow up with that too, that the main way that I thought about it, both for the first piece that I really worked on with the ghost plate in mind, was the piece that Ellie mentioned, which was an orchestral piece for the Cabrillo Festival of Contemporary Music, actually the very last one that they were able to do live because of the pandemic. But I really was experimenting with blending with the strings, and so I felt like I had a good handle of how it can do that, and especially warning the string players when and when not to tune directly to it, which became really important with ensemble strings, of course. But the one other part that I wanted to mention was for each movement was kind of inflected. When we switched to the remote kind of concept, basically what we did was everybody played their parts and we pre-recorded those, and then they were baked into the electronics track. And so all of these movements could be performed live with the full ensemble, or they can be performed with the soloist and everything else kind of wrapped into the electronics. And so that's how we did it for today with the Zoom performance. But each individual movement that features an instrument like that kind of brings out some of the qualities that are being referenced there of the instrument. For instance, the very opening movement, I-core, starts off with that really kind of intense sound where the ghost plate is being struck, and the other part of the sound, the other component there, is Kyle's oboe. I had written into the score, to see if he could find basically a multiphonic that worked in that register, and how would this kind of blend with the ghost plate. And it gave it this really lovely, haunting quality when kind of paired with the ghost plate, because it's kind of slidey. It kind of moves around a little bit. There's some motivity to the note itself. And it also is just kind of ethereal and otherworldly in its sound. And so actually I ended up, and this wasn't necessarily planned, but I ended up kind of bringing that same recorded piece of audio back in at the very end of the movement Nocturne. And so it was interesting to have that sound kind of play against the cello at that point, because the cello is kind of doing this languid kind of melodic phrases, and then to have that sound just push really far into the background, it just emphasized for me the differences of the ways that the acoustic instruments all interact with the ghost plate itself.
So Jen, do you want to ask your question? It's really, it's very important to.
Sure. I'll try to kind of recover it. It's in the chat in a more sort of like thought out, streamlined way probably. But I was really interested in this notion of the made versus the born as a long kind of, deep with deep historical resonance, but also so important for contemporary life. And so in in my own work as an art historian, I have been thinking about that with respect to the sort of mytho-history of Pandora and the gendered nature of that history. But I was just wondering if you guys could expand a little bit about how that, I don't know, tension or difference between the made versus the born plays out in your musical practice, and if you would care to connect that to a sort of broader politics of the work, I would also be interested to hear about that.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I know that as I was designing the piece, that's basically what I was thinking of, but I was mostly referencing the work that Adrienne Mayor had done in Gods and Robots. And she talks quite a bit. There's an entire chapter that focuses on Pandora. And, one of the interesting things about Greek myths is that they're not consistent and they change over time. And as an art historian, I'm sure you're well aware of that, but that was one of the things that I found really fascinating about these myths is that we can kind of take lessons from them both in how they're written, but also how they evolve over time. The myths about Daedalus, for instance, are totally different with their Athenian roots than they are in Sardinia or these other places. There's like everybody wanted to claim Daedalus, but there's totally different evolutions of that story. And it's kind of similar with Pandora, but as far as the main elements that rung significant to me about the Pandora myth is that every story of her is pretty consistent, which is rare, but pretty consistent in that she is created, right? She is not. There aren't really any versions where she's born. I mean, there's a lot of. I'm not sure exactly where it comes from. It's not in the sources that I've found, but there's a lot of people who kind of associate Pandora with the first woman, kind of like an Eve correlation.
He is. So he talks about her as first woman cases. Before Pandora, there was no womankind. Is something
right. Yeah, and so. Yeah, well, no, that's interesting because then it kind of would imply that she was at least able to procreate or, have children, maybe, as the first woman. But most of the ones reference her being made out of some sort of material and kind of, and she's specifically crafted, to punish humans. The other interesting part of that story that I resonated with for the music was the fact that not only is she created specifically for that purpose, but she's in many of the myths given specifically to Epimetheus, the brother of Prometheus, and just the concept there of the kind of the moralizing element that's being kind of put onto the myth of basically talking about the difference between foresight and afterthought in that context was interesting. But every single iteration that I have found to read speaks pretty directly about the fact that her sexuality was really important to the story. Like the fact that she was an attractive female, it was female creature created of whatever else is very significant. That was part of the myth in every iteration, and the other part of it that resonated with me a little bit, and it was interesting also the way that the AI kind of continued that particular text, was that a lot of people associate, we kind of hear this story of Pandora and we think, okay, well, all these evils are released, but then there's hope, and that's a good thing. But Adrienne Mayor does a good job of describing in Gods and Robots how the actual original texts tend to cast that in not such a positive light. It really translates more to something like blind hope, not really hope in the kind of hopeful way that we associate it. And so it wasn't so much that left in the jar. Or the box as it's been kind of permutated through the ages, but left in the jar was something positive that we can kind of all rally around and, maybe it wasn't so bad after all. That's not really the point of the myth in most iterations, as far as I can tell.
I'll also weigh in on the role of technology in the creation of the piece. The ghostplate, now that you've seen a demonstration of it and you've seen the videos of it, you'll see that like the sound itself, without knowing, it sounds like it's electronic. Some of the soundscape that it creates, even though it's a completely acoustic instrument, and that totally turns our concept of the evolution of music in the modern day to sort of digital and processed sounds that we expect of modern music. It totally turns it on its head and messes with what you expect an instrument or a piece of music to sound like and where it comes from. Since we're all classically trained musicians, we all come from some kind of, music school training or conservatory, where the role of technology in the modern sense is frowned upon in a lot of ways, or we're very hesitant to incorporate it. And yet, our instruments were state of the art at one time that we play on. That's technically considered technology, and technology has been really intimate in the creation of the music. The fact that we're recording, adding processed sounds later, and then sometimes not. And it, even though it sounds processed, so that line between made versus born is very deeply embedded in the creation process of the music.
I think a lot of our instruments can already make a lot of these electronic sounds, but they're not permitted in the sound space that we work in classical music. So I think it's almost not so much about like what's producing the instrument, but just what sounds are permitted in our soundscapes and in our genres. Because I notice a lot of the same sentiments with classical musicians about modern music, which utilizes a lot of alternative extended techniques.
And if I can add one thing, I just think it's an interesting question, made versus born. And, from a compositional standpoint, I mean, I shouldn't speak for Costas, but, when I compose something, there's certain things that are inspiration that, just come, and it's like you just write down what you had in your dream. And then there's the construction aspect of something. And it's a question I think about all the time as when I'm writing stuff. I don't know if Costas feels the same way.
Absolutely, and I'll also add to that it was something that we had talked about. It wasn't going to be a hard line, but it was definitely, we preferenced towards musicians who are also composers because everybody who played today is also a composer, and so that just gives you a slightly different perspective sometimes. And for this particular piece, especially in the ways that we were being limited, I wanted to make sure we were also exploring some of the benefits of that space. And so I would say that there was a little bit of exploration of made versus born in the techniques that were both notated very explicitly, but then some that were a little bit more open. The multiphonics that I mentioned at the beginning there, you saw a lot of kind of aleatoric, free things happen. The movement solitude in particular I was trying to experiment philosophically with that concept, because the score for that piece is basically just a series of dyads. They just have two notes, and it's rhythmically notated. They know how long they're supposed to do them for, but it's up to them. It's up to the player to choose which of the two notes to experiment with, and you can microtonally move basically everything up to a half step away. Not don't quite ever go to a half step away, but so that it creates this interesting blurry texture. And their rhythms were actually generated through the concept of speech, and so they were actually basically playing through a Wallace Stevens poem it's not used in the piece. It's not supposed to be projected for the concert. It is exclusively a piece of the score that they were playing. And so that was one of the ways that I was trying to experiment with that concept, because it's a different way of creating music in that sense. And I was very happy with how that movement turned out, because that was one that I was a little nervous about once we moved to the remote format, because in person you can be playing off of each other like that and doing a little bit more. But I almost think the isolation, and especially since the movement is called Solitude, I feel like it really had a nice emotional resonance, and I really was really happy with how everyone kind of interpreted that as well.
There's another question in the chat from Kirk Reedstrom. Do you want to ask it, Kirk?
Hey, Costas.
Hey, Kirk. Kirk is a friend of mine from college, actually, violinist.
I wanted to hear a little bit more about decisions behind using artificial intelligence to alter or expand upon the source material from Gods and Robots. It sounds like you are echoing that in the music that you made, and it seems to be resonant in much of what you do. So I'd just like to hear a little bit more about it.
Definitely, yeah. So you're exactly right. That's kind of what I was thinking, was that it allows an extension of the material that is not directly created from a human. It's basically allows and each movement was kind of generated independently. And the kind of the source text, or what I'm calling text prompts for those, were actually pre-compositional words that I was writing right before I actually wrote the piece. So none of the music was written at those points, but it was kind of some of the concepts that I was mulling over that then inflected the individual movements. And so it was kind of an interesting bookend for me, because I didn't actually generate the artificial intelligence part of it until after the piece was all completed. And so it was kind of the very beginning of the process and the very end of the process completely human generated and completely not human generated. You know, those, it was important to me that those AI pieces not be edited, which makes for some strange parts. I'm sure you noticed if you were able to follow along with them. There's sometimes when you can tell that the AI is trying to generate words that aren't words and things like that. But it was all responsory to the human prompt. So in the same way that we kind of found, you know, there's kind of like there's a feedback loop happening between the instrument, you know, from the beginning, because you're tied to the pitches that it can that it can produce, and then I write to those pitches, and then I send it to the instrumentalist, and there's some improvisation on their parts at times, and so I felt like that was a nice way to also continue that into the machine kind of concept toward the end. So that was my main reason for the AI, to use the AI there, was to kind of experiment with that idea of made versus born. But then the other piece of it is I really liked for this, kind of like the way I just described Solitude, where I gave pitches, but then they had to, every player had to kind of express that through speech rhythms. They had to basically imagine how they would read this poem if they were giving a reading of it, and then play on their instrument with the general contour and timbre of that speech, which is just, I found interesting because they're having to triangulate multiple pieces of data and bring them together into something that comes out to be music. And that's what I wanted a little bit from the program notes as well. I wanted the myth to be there, and so that is front and center. You kind of know where the source material is, but then there's some text written by a human and some text written by a machine, and kind of finding the ways that all of those work together was what I was trying to do there, that I found interesting.
It's kind of the definition of a multimedia work, and I had a couple of other little questions. One is, has Adrienne heard it? And the other is, who chose the wonderful videos and images?
Oh, the videos, I have to give most of the credit to Ellie. We recorded them, but you know, every piece of the videos, Ellie, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about those. But I will say, yes, Adrienne Mayor was able to make it to our performance at UC Berkeley, and so it was virtual like this, but she was able to be there, and so that was an honor to have her there.
Yeah.
What were her thoughts?
I would blush to read them. She was very she seemed like she really appreciated it. So I don't have them here, but we definitely saved it. I think we want to put it on the album or something, with some kind of quote.
I put it on our page on talosdreams.com, but she thought it was ethereal, and she really enjoyed the tension in the made versus born tension that came out in the music and in the playing. It was, you know, lovely to kind of hear that from her, and it felt like our response to horror work came full circle in that way, so that was really lovely. To speak to the videos, yes, I produced the videos. A couple of the music videos were done, you could probably imagine, remotely, where each of us was recording from home. When we featured those in a contemporary music festival, Hot Air Festival, which is at the San Francisco Conservatory, a couple months ago. And then the other ones that were where we're all together, I organized those. We actually were at my friend's farm, about an hour from the Bay Area, where they have a junkyard. They work on race cars and things. It's my other life, and so we did photography on the ground, and I had a friend doing aerial photography as well. In Solitude, I videoed that footage came from Lake Tahoe. Mostly, I was pulling from the poem that by Stevens that was in there, in the score, and so we're pulling, rivers and lakes and flowing, all of these words that that came from the poetry were in there, ducks fluttering and things like that we tried to replicate in our sounds. So I wanted to bring a little bit of that representational thing back into the imagery for the piece, and I hope that the combination of the two really heightens the emotion of the whole thing. So I'm really glad you enjoyed it, Susan.
I did. I also enjoyed the contrast between your performing outside and in your studios. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, the contrast was delicious. Just for me personally, it had been the first time I had my oboe in the presence of another human being in the 14 months. And the fact that we were doing it outside in a junkyard, being photographed by drone photography, just made it all the more surreal and wonderful. But yeah, it's that's a dimension of the work that we really haven't touched on here, is the just psychological damage of being an artist during this era and having what we do be something that we have not been able to do in shared space. So that that dimension of the technology is another tangle of the knot entirely. So yeah, it was a blast to spend a day outside with
And
friends.
how ironic that you were happy to do it in a junkyard. It didn't matter, just to be outside, right?
Yeah, similarly, it's just like these are the places where we're allowed to play now, is inside in our own homes and outside. And I mean, playing a string player, being a string player, it's a little bit more, it's a little safer to play outside with each other. When you're playing wind instruments, there is a little bit more cause for concern, but still, there's a reason why we didn't do a video of all of us playing together in a concert hall. It's because it's just not an option. So I really applaud, the main creative forces behind this project, Ellie and Costas, for figuring out a way to make for a compelling project.
I think it really speaks to the creativity of, I think, just artists and musicians. I feel like we're always kind of being pushed to be creative anyway, but I think what this is, I mean, the whole quarantine experience has shown me is just how artists and musicians learn to persevere. And they're all like, I feel like every musician and artist I've known has found a way to be flexible within these restrictions, whether it's, learning how to put together a whole recording studio within our own homes. Like Ellie and I have had multiple back and forths trying to learn from each other about how to set up equipment. And during this whole process, Costas was helping us troubleshoot, things with Logic. And I imagine, we will one day maybe do this in a concert hall, but I also think it's really a treasure that we have these videos and we got to play in a junkyard. And we got to, we got to find creative ways to make something like this happen. And it was very much a group effort. And, and I feel like, there have been a lot of people who have been really supportive also throughout this time, knowing that basically our livelihoods kind of got destroyed for about a year. But still, like, there's people out there who are still showing up to things like live streams and, and buying albums and all the things that really support artists.
This music is very different from the usual. It's really boundary pushing, and these are people that tuned into our last stream, and so being more comfortable sonically with the music the second time around, I think what's happening is we're here stretching boundaries. We're stretching our own boundaries, our skill set, and the things that are demanded of us to create this music is being stretched. And I think the music stretches the listener. So every time that you're hearing it again, I think you're getting climatized to this new soundscape, which is, I think, very adventurous. And that's really all about the Greek Chamber Music Project, the idea of stretching the listener and stretching the players, to play something different from the usual, and to question what, who makes classical or contemporary music. And yeah, I hope that kind of answers your question or sparks some thoughts around it.
When I heard Costas talk a little bit about it sounded to me like aleatoric music meets Johannes Ockeghem. The idea that things could be performed in any mode in the experiments of the 15th century in that regard, or chance music of the 20th century. And that you're all composers, I think, is, for me, a very significant piece of information. Because as composers, you have a different perspective than performers who don't compose. And having been through the composition training, but not composing anymore, I have envy, a composer envy. So maybe you want to talk a bit about your compositions and how they relate to this latest piece.
Well, one point is that I actually do have a piece called Ockeghem's Razor, so you definitely picked up on a fair influence in my own work. But the main thing I would say for this piece, and kind of following up on the previous question as well, is that one of the things that Ellie and I decided early on with this is that each movement could be, well, first of all, she let me be as weird as I wanted to be, which I appreciated. But one of the things that we did to kind of make it hopefully a little bit easier to digest is we kept every movement quite short, right? For classical pieces, each movement was mostly between 3 and 4 minutes long. I think a couple are 4.5. But that basically allowed us to encapsulate an emotion or a concept or explore a topic in a brief amount of time, right? And then you kind of move. It's almost like even if it's an uncomfortable color that you don't know how to feel about it, it's on to something else in the next one. And I will just say quickly, I'm sure Ellie will mention it as well, but the album is available now too. So if you can listen to that, you can and listen a couple of times through these ones. Then that's the hope, is that that you're able to kind of digest it on first listen, but then maybe it sounded like the original question was saying that this was that it was enjoyed even more this time around, and I am not surprised about that, because I do think it's a lot of information to process on first listen like that. But like I said, everybody is a composer, and so I actually don't know. Ellie and Ellie, I think, had her album compositional debut on Synchronos, right? So, but maybe you guys want to talk about how you feel like you approached it differently because you are also composers.
So yeah, I have a piece on the album as well that Ariel and Lewis are featured on. And yeah, I think that especially the pieces where there's areas to improvise and create, and there's some leeway written into the score, I think that's what improvisation is composing in the moment. And maybe you're pulling in from your own musical language that you've practiced or have trained on in that. But I think that that's the number one way I see, um, putting your composition hat on applies to this project.
It's our relationship with each other is not just as performers but also as composers. So Ellie and I have played. We played her piece that she just was talking about, but she also has performed a flute cello duo a few times that I wrote, and Ariel and I are always playing each other's music, and it's part of the relationship that we have with each other. We're creative partners, and we support each other in different ways. And when it comes to performing a piece, I think just as a composer, you realize it really makes a difference if people try. You want people to try their best when they're playing your music, and so when you're playing someone else's music, you try. That's really, it's as simple as that.
Yeah, and I think that something that I really noticed the more composing I did was, as an instrumentalist, I feel like I'm very trained to hyper focus on my part, and how it fits within a bigger piece. But when I started composing, I realized just how much information you get from having an incredibly comprehensive understanding of a piece. Which, again, I feel like, I've played a lot of chamber music, I've played in orchestras. It's not so much that you never look at the score and don't want to know what other people's parts are, but I think that the composer hat makes me a lot more creative, and I think expansive in the way I think about the part that I play within a piece. And I think especially for new music, it's a very different experience playing, say, like a Beethoven quartet that has been played for hundreds of years and has been studied, and versus something that's brand new, where this is our really only our second complete performance. So I feel like even within performances, there's still room to explore and push boundaries, where I feel like the more instrumentalist part of me is like, no, tell me what to do and how things are set and kind of what the expectations are. Whereas I feel like with this, I'm like, I mean, yeah, that element is there, but I'm kind of more willing to be like, hey, Costas, what about this weird idea that I had for how to play this? Is that okay? And I feel like there's a lot more growth still happening with the new piece, and with new compositions. with our composer hats than, say, playing like a Beethoven or a Shostakovich or Bach or any of those old greats.
Brilliant. That's really wonderful. Are there any other questions? Because I think we have to wrap up, Ellie. Am I right? This has just been such a treat. And I think the future of classical music is here in these chamber ensembles that are innovative and with people who really are able to tweak the boundaries and are not just looking at a score and slavishly bound to it. And I say that coming from a conservatory background. So I know this is being recorded, but this has just been an eye-opener in so many ways. Ellie, do you want to end it?
Sure. Thank you all for coming and attending. We have such a dedicated audience here to sit through the whole discussion. I hope it was inspiring to you, the music and the discussion, and spark some new ideas. And as I've included in the chat and alluded to briefly, album that's come out today called Synchronos New Greek Voices. And it's available for streaming and purchase through my website, greekchambermusic.com. So anyway, thank you all again for being here. Thank you, Susan, and to Johns Hopkins University for sponsoring and hosting us today.
And thanks to Jen in the art history department too, and all of you. Really, I have a new phrase, improv is composing in the moment. Thank you, Ariel. I love that. And I want Akagim's razor, so Costas, please send it to me. Okay, bye everyone.
Bye everyone, thank you.